Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm your host, Alan Moore, and today I'm honored to be able to bring you what might end up being the most important XYPN Radio episode we've ever done. I'm joined today by Kathleen Boyd, a Black queer female, newly minted CFP advisor, and Bill Simonet, a first-generation Haitian American financial advisor. As you'll hear in this episode, we started a conversation at FPABE earlier this year regarding not just the lack of diversity in financial planning, but why it is so hard, especially for folks like myself, it's a white male, to have a conversation about diversity. Both Kathleen and Bill were quick to remind me that it's not just about diversity. It's also about inclusion and creating a culture where people can thrive no matter their background. I learned so much from their experiences and point of view, and I encourage you to listen to this episode in its entirety. I think you'll walk away with a better understanding of the barriers and issues minorities face in our industry and how we can begin to break down those barriers. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank both of these advisors for having the courage to come on the show today and talk about this difficult but unbelievably important topic. You can find any of the additional resources that we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/131. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN Radio listeners. It's a community of advisors we've all been looking for that's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here's my interview with Bill and Kathleen. Hey, Kathleen and Bill, thank you so much and welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being on.
Thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to be on your podcast. It's a privilege.
Absolutely, Alan. I'm definitely thrilled to be able to be back on here with you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll see where this conversation goes. Before we kick off, I'll introduce you to our guests. Bill was on the show back in episode 126 talking about his career path and his path to starting a firm. So if you want to learn more about Bill, just go to xyplanningnetwork.com/126 and you can hear an hour of he and I talking about his career path. But I do want to give Kathleen an opportunity to introduce herself because she is a rock star in her own right. So Kathleen, could you just give me sort of a brief background on your sort of career path, your path into planning and sort of, I guess, what led to you being on XYPN Radio today?
Yes. Well, a little bit about me. I am a high school dropout turned newly minted certified financial planner as of Thursday of last week. I also work as an associate wealth advisor for a small fee-only financial planning firm in Redondo Beach, California called Navigo. I'm also a second-year PhD student at Kansas State University's Financial Planning and Therapy distance-based program. And I identify as a queer woman of color. And so I represent multiple underrepresented groups in a way that's not very common in our profession. There aren't very many CFPs out there like me. And so I'm on this show because I feel that I have a unique and valid perspective as it relates to our challenges around being a more diverse profession.
Yeah, and you make a good point that you represent several minority populations inside of financial planning and really, I mean, in our country in general. I have never seen sexual orientation data in financial planning, but I suspect whenever we include female, queer, and person of color, we're talking, I mean, that is a very, very small minority of folks in financial planning. I can't imagine how minuscule the number must be.
Right.
So I appreciate you being willing to come on the show, and thanks for giving a little bit of a background on yourself. I'm really excited to have you both on, and I guess I'll turn it to Bill and just ask this question to you as well. So Bill, what made you want to come on the show today?
I'm a Black guy with a predominantly white female client base, and amongst my conversations with my colleagues and my peers and my clients, race and gender comes up way more than I would expect it to. And also, I've gotten to the point where I've learned to just simply accept that I'm going to be one of the few people in the room that look like me or who might have the background that I do. And I'd like to be able to address it. I'd like to be able to help bridge the gap and help start or expand on the conversation of race, gender, and cultural differences that tend to keep us apart.
Well, again, I want to thank you both for coming on the show. I said a little bit in the intro about what the topic today was going to be, but we have mentioned the topic of diversity, whether it be underrepresentation of females or underrepresentation of people of color in financial planning. It's come up on the show several times. I don't know how many exactly, but we never just had a show dedicated to just having an open and honest conversation about the conversation of diversity, right? So first we can sort of lay out the statistics. So we pulled together some stats. So just so that we know sort of where financial planning is at today and sort of our collective goals for where it's headed. So according to the U.S. Census data and BLS, or Bureau of Labor Statistics, 8.1% of financial advisors are African American, and 7.1% are Hispanic or Latino. So 8.1% African American, 7.1% Hispanic or Latino. Whereas in the country, 13% of Americans identify as African American and 17% identify as Hispanic or Latino. So you're talking about a 5% difference, but I mean, on a relative basis, you're talking about almost double, or almost half, I guess, of the number or percentage of Americans that identify as African American are represented as financial advisors, even less so for Hispanics and Latinos. And so that's sort of one segment that we're going to be talking about is race. And then in terms of gender, this is a number folks are probably used to hearing, which is that only 23% of CFP professionals are women. I was not able to find another statistic I have seen in the past, but that was of all people that work inside of financial services. So just across the plethora of all the options, only 8% of people in financial services are women. Again, I can't back that up with data, but the 23% is right there. Whereas we know that 51% of the population are women. And so we have both, obviously a race conversation here, a gender conversation. And one of the things I have come to learn is that, women that identify as a person of, or that is a person of color also has unique challenges that white women or, African-American men don't necessarily have. And so we sort of have a lot of pieces that we can talk about, but I just want to sort of lay out the numbers so that we can say how sort of where things are at today. And I think we're all in agreement, correct me if I'm wrong, but our goal is to see that financial planning as an industry should reflect the statistics and the gender and racial breakdown of the United States.
I agree.
Me too.
I absolutely agree. I think that's what we should be striving for.
So I guess just to sort of lead into where this conversation came from. So we were all three at FPA BE. I'm always on KITSIS guard duty. So my job is to herd KITSIS through the exhibit hall and cut off conversations that are taking too long because I need him somewhere. And so I was headed to go get KITSIS, and Bill, you stopped me, and we've met several times before, so you were comfortable asking this question. But you just looked at me and said, Alan, I have a quick question for you. Why is diversity such a hard thing for white men to talk about?
Yeah.
That was a question. And I have to admit, when the question got asked, I was immediately like, what the heck? Why are you asking me? Like, why are you being a jerk about it? And like, I'm immediately getting defensive. And I was like, all right, hang on. It's Bill. I know he's coming from a good place. Like, let's talk about it. And I don't know if I walked into a heated conversation or exchange between the two of you or just happened to walk in at the right moment. But it is a really good question because, again, we talk a lot about diversity, but we don't talk a lot about the struggle to talk about diversity because it is a hard conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I will preface it. You did come in. Kathleen and I were engaging with some of our white counterparts. And before you came up, what kind of sparked the whole conversation around this was we were talking about the FPA Diversity Scholarship. And then one of the FPA advisors came up and was admiring Kathleen's hair and wanted to touch it. And it kind of struck a nerve. And so we dove into a conversation on why that's probably not appropriate and why we shouldn't expect. And here's the rub of it, why we shouldn't expect anything different in this environment, even though we're all professionals and we're all well-meaning, even in that room, even in that environment, that should be something that we expect. And you are the perfect person to come by and provide us the perspective that Kathleen and I would not have had clarity on, because we're not white men. So
yeah, Kathleen, you'll have to see a picture, Kathleen, because you do have awesome hair. And you do not, I guess, to be frank, like you don't have hair that a white woman is probably going to be able to have. Like it is, you have unique hair. So I guess why was that uncomfortable? Why was it uncomfortable for someone to say, can I touch your hair?
It's uncomfortable. It's actually an experience that happens to me quite frequently. And not only will people ask to touch my hair, there will be other folks who won't even ask. They'll just take the liberty of just touching it. And it's very frustrating because it feels very exoticizing, like you're exoticizing me as a woman of color. You're exoticizing some part of me. And you're sort of using your white privilege or your male privilege in a sense to exert your power on my body. And so that's very frustrating.
Yeah. And given everything that has been happening over the last couple of months, and that is a whole, sexual harassment is just a whole other conversation. But whenever we talk about race and gender and just diversity topics, okay, and we're going to talk about this, but there's a massive gray area. There are very blurred lines in terms of what's appropriate to say, what's not, how you talk about it, how we communicate it. It's not clear cut. Sexual harassment is extremely clear cut. And there's a line called don't touch other people. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to draw this don't touch other people line in the sand, and that will solve 90% of the problems that we have. So in the exhibit hall or any other professional event or just any event in your life, do not touch someone without their permission. And don't even ask. If you have to ask, then the answer should be no. And then the other 10% of the sexual harassment stuff just comes from don't be an ass, quite frankly, and let's learn boundaries. But those are harder boundaries to draw. But all of that to say, I think it's fair to say, because the majority of listeners to this podcast are going to be white men, because that is financial planning. That's just where the statistics are. And I want to be very clear that at no point in this, based on the several conversations we've all had and emails we've exchanged, at no point are we ever trying to make anyone feel bad for being white or feel bad for being male. That is not something you can help. Okay, that is how you were born. That is where things are at. We are not trying to say any white man is a bad, or that being a white male makes you bad, or that it is a bad thing, or that's a negative, or anything else. Really what we're saying is that being a person of color or being female or being gay is not bad either, and that it shouldn't be looked down upon. So just know that, these are hard. This is a hard topic, I think, sometimes because the people that we want to hear it are the ones who will see the word diversity in the title and just not download the episode because I don't care. I don't want to hear that. And so I suspect my prediction is that this episode will have fewer downloads than the vast majority of our other episodes, unless I change the title to make it sound something cool and fun that people want to show up and listen to. And then we hook them real fast, right?
Actually,
the bait and switch.
There you go. Actually,
all about bait and switch.
I'll go one step further. I'll say where Michael Kitces gets his blue shirts should be the title.
I love it. So that's how we're going to hook people in. But I will say that if you're listening to this episode and you're like, why am I even listening to this? Maybe you're a white male, or, maybe you're not, but saying like, this doesn't apply to me, or I don't care. Like, please just give us the next 50 minutes of your time. Because I think just based on the conversations we've had in the past, I think this will be impactful. My response to you, I had to think about it for a second around, why is this such a hard topic for white men to talk about? My response to you, and I'll say my response has actually changed over the last couple of months since I gave you this response. But my immediate response was for fear of saying the wrong thing. And I have said the wrong thing before. And in this day and age of social media, the assumption is if I say something that is vague, and it can be taken with a positive way that says like, oh, Alan just misspoke, or it can be taken with a negative of Alan is a racist. We tend to lean to the negative, or at least that's what gets posted on social media, or that's what I get emails about is, I can't believe you said this, you're a racist. So there's this fear of like, if we could go one direction, we don't assume the best in people anymore. We sort of assume the worst. So I think, and again, I'll blame that on social media. So it tends to go negative. And so it makes it hard to know what to say and what not to say, quite frankly, for just fear of offending people. Because like, I don't want to offend anybody by saying like even just a minute ago, I was like, can I say gay or should I say queer? Because like Kathleen said queer. So should I say that because she said like, and I don't want to offend Kathleen because I used incorrect terminology and offend in a way that, didn't occur to me because, I'm not gay or queer. And so therefore don't know. I guess I just don't live that. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm saying that.
Let's do it this way.
Accurately.
When having a conversation about race and gender issues, one of the questions that tends to come up is, do I say Black people or do I call you an African American?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm first generation Haitian. My family is from the island of Haiti. I'm not an African American. I'm a Haitian American. I am of dark skin. Black people, we refer to each other as Black people generally, and in some circles, African American. And if we really want to be super professional and go down that path, we'll say that. But I think that's the qualm, right? Is it wrong for me to say, as a white person, Alan, if you were to talk about Black people in general, you saying Black people inherently feels offensive, but it is not, because African American is not accurate. I mean, it's just not, it's not the appropriate term either. So that's the crux of it, right?
Yeah, and Kathleen, you told me at one point that you don't identify with African American either, even though you do have, I presume, African heritage.
I really don't know what I am, to be honest with you. I think it's problematic when people and they assume to know where they're from. And as you said, I don't. If I am of African descent, I don't really identify with that side. I don't know anything about Africa. I've never been to Africa. I know myself as an American. And that's how I identify. I'm an American.
And I can tell you from my perspective, that is, Bill started to allude to it. It's very difficult or maybe even frustrating because I was raised that you don't say Black. And again, I'm now seeing a couple of iterations of this, but like, it wasn't like brown was a more accurate representation. And it was, that you say brown, not Black. And then it was people of color and African American. And so I think there are some possible people of color that are listening to this like, heck no, I identify as African American. I don't identify as Black. So is there is it up to, as a white man, is it up to me to determine what you're comfortable with is, or is it up to you to just get over it, quite frankly? Because where's the middle ground, I guess?
Well, my question is, why do you have to determine anything? It seems like I start a conversation with someone who's white. Their first question is, where are you from? They want to know where I'm from. And when I say, oh, I'm from California, and then they say, no, where are you really from? It's like, why does that? Yes, it's like, why does that matter? Why is that one of the first questions we ask people? Where are they from? Why does that matter? Are you going to treat me differently because of it?
I have a little bit more of a pragmatic view on that one. We talked a little bit about my kids and my background. My wife is Japanese and Ukrainian. I'm Haitian. We live here in Texas. My children are all kinds of different shades. And because of that, the kids get the question all the time, or they're like, oh my God, your parents must be so beautiful. Well, on one side, yes. On the other side, me, maybe not so much. But I think there's an interest to it because it supports the idea of diversity in this country. And some people view it as fascinating to see what it's like leaving your cereal in the milk bowl too long, right? If it's Golden Grams, the milk will still taste good, but it's not white anymore, or brown, or whatever the case may be. And so I think people are naturally curious because you look different. I don't see the issue with it. It's when the question, I see what happened. In my case, the problem that I start to see is the follow-up question to that. So in Kathleen's case, you live in California now, but you were raised where, in Seattle, I think, or
Salt Lake City, Utah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Salt Lake City, Utah. And there's this dark-skinned girl with, with kinky hair. And one of the comments that I'm sure you've heard is, I didn't think there were any Black people in Salt Lake City, Utah, especially if they weren't playing basketball or on the football team, right?
Right. Or in my case, they assume that I'm a refugee from Africa.
Yeah.
I got that question a lot. Are you a refugee?
I appreciate that you're able to laugh about that. What I hear when you're able to laugh about that is, I suspect, and this is just a guess, but correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe the first time you were asked that, you probably didn't laugh about it.
Right.
It wasn't funny the first time. It got funny the 100th time, which speaks to I'm always a little bit in a gasp of when y'all talk about things that people say to you or ask you, and I'm just like, oh, come on. That had to have happened once.
Yeah.
And obviously if you're laughing about it, it didn't just happen once. This is something you've become accustomed to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that you get used to. And in the world that we live in now, as professionals, you don't see very many Black people in our business, Black women especially, unless you're on the insurance side. On the fee-only side, the RIA side, this is something that is growing. And there's an association out now that focuses on bringing that culture together, bringing, Black advisors together. I think it's Quad A.
Yeah, Quad A. I believe it stands for African American Association of Advisors, or Association of African American Advisors. But yeah, Quad A is now, and I think they've been around for 30 years, but I think they are just now sort of getting some traction amongst, the work that they're doing.
And there's clear evidence that there's a need for it. Morgan Stanley, Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch, they had their lawsuits regarding promotions for men and people of color not being able to move up because they didn't graduate from certain schools and they weren't part of the good old boy club. And then Raymond James decided to tackle this issue head on by actually starting their own African American Advisors Initiative, where what they're doing is they're specifically working with their Black financial advisors, and they put together a forum where they can work together and mentor so that advisors of color can continue to grow, which I think is tremendous. But they had the courage to be able to say, I know this is something we have to talk about, including all the backlash that comes along with it.
I definitely want to talk about sort of both of your takes on how do we make a difference, because I think that that's such an important piece. I think we can all reiterate that we don't have the answer, and we're not here to, and I'm certainly not here to give the answer on how do we fix this issue in financial planning. But I almost feel like there's a couple of pieces and they're all intertwined. I mean, one piece is just the pure statistics on where we are at and where we'd like to go. And there is okay, how do we get from point A to point B in terms of just increasing the number of, minority population or, folks from minority populations into financial planning. But there's also this area of just sort of having an honest conversation around the experiences that people that are not white men are having in our industry. So I guess I'll open the floor to both of you to just sort of enlighten me, I guess, if you will. Just tell me some of your experiences that you've had that you would say, look, white men don't deal with this in our profession, whether it be inside of a firm or, at a conference is another area of this or anything like that. So I guess anything you want to bring to the table that just to sort of give us a framework, just a little bit of insight into the experiences that y'all have to deal with. So Kathleen, I'll let you lead this off, if you will.
Yes. Well, like I said, I identify as a queer woman of color. And so I have to deal with multiple challenges since I represent multiple groups. Most people don't know about the queer part of me because I, quote unquote, don't look gay. If you've seen a photo of me or you've engaged with me in person, I'm very feminine.
And people have told you that you don't look gay?
Yes, both within the LGBT community and outside of it. When people find out I'm gay, it's like the shock of their life. So I don't necessarily have to deal with oppression on that side unless I volunteer that information. But around being a woman and a woman of color, I've definitely experienced my own challenges within this industry. It's been a challenge looking for work. I'm very lucky that to have found the firm that I work for now. But before I landed where I was, it took me almost a year and a half to find a job. And I felt like the hiring processes and sort of the interview processes firms have out there, they're filled with biases. Some of the questions I would ask were very invasive. And they were presented under the guise that they were trying to find a good culture fit. And I feel like that term culture fit is such a nebulous term because deep down, I think firms just want to find people who agree with them, who have the same point of view, who act like them, that talk like them. And that's just not me. I've worked for firms where I've been called stupid. I've worked for firms where I was told that I don't belong in this business, that I have no business being an advisor, that I'm off sitting in a cubicle in a back office doing analysis and research, but I shouldn't be in front of clients. And so I feel like there's still this problematic perception that people have of women of color, that we're not good enough, that we're not smart enough, that we can't put out the same quality of work. And so that's something that I've had to fight and struggle through.
Thank you for sharing that. I wonder, and I haven't been in the room with you to see this, but I would be interested in your, I guess, best guess on this. Like, do you think it's mostly unconscious bias, or do you see some of the experiences that you've had and look at that and go, no, like he knew what he was saying and he knew why he was saying it, and I can't prove it because it was a sort of a gray area comment, but sort of you felt like they knew what they were doing, or do you feel like a lot of the bias comes from an unconscious place?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. It's both unconscious and conscious bias, but at the end of the day, it all hurts the same.
Yeah. Unconscious bias is probably the biggest issue across the board, and we all suffer from it. My biggest thing, to answer your question, Alan, on my side, is when being the diversity hire and then being expected to be the first Black to do X or to set the tone. At my previous firm that I worked with, one of the conversations that I had with my managing partner, he's like, don't you want to be, not my managing, our regional director was like, don't you want to be the first Black regional director for our company? Don't you want to make that stamp and be that guy? No, not really. I mean, I don't want to have to speak on behalf of everyone, nor do I want to have to be the coming messiah that's going to go and save all Black people and help them save more in their 401k. Within the industry, the conversation always goes to, well, what does your client base look like? Who do you generally work with? And, we'd love, or one of the conversations is we'd love to get more Black people involved in financial planning or taking advantage of investments. And there's a legitimate argument there. But the expectation that I'm the person with the answer to go in and do that it's ignorant, right? And I think that that's the conversation that most Black men specifically in financial planning will have to deal with, right? Black men will have to answer for why there are not more Black men or women or Black families involved in financial planning. And I think it also affects other cultures. For example, Asian advisors, I'm sure that Asian advisors have a stereotype or an expectation that their math and their numbers are always going to be better. Therefore, work with an Asian or work with an Indian advisor because, they work hard, they know their math, so on and so forth, those stereotypes. And I'm pretty sure that that's going to be one of the challenges that they face. Now, the question is, if we know that this is a bias that we face, Alan, as a white guy, what's the bias that you hear? What is your expectation? And do you feel like you have to answer any of those questions, or do you have to answer to that same type of viewpoint?
I will say that I have never been in a room where a conversation was had that was, we're not going to hire him because he's Black, or they're, she's a woman or she's a Black woman, so therefore she's not going to be able to perform here. She's not a good culture fit. I've never been involved in I don't think I've ever witnessed just like true, overt, conscious bias, if you will. Unconscious bias, absolutely. And I think we see that across the industry. But it is difficult, I think, because white men particularly are not used to thinking about race or gender. It's not a thought for us. I've never walked in a room and, just assume like, okay, well, I'm going to have to really step up here because I'm male. I'm going to really have to put my best foot forward. Or, you know what, I'm white and that's going to be a disadvantage in this situation. So I'm going to really have to step up. Like I've never had that thought, and I've never needed to have that thought. And I feel like, professionally and personally, what you both have expressed is that is a thought that y'all are having to overcome or deal with on a regular basis. This is not a one-off, happens once every couple of years.
Right. That's true. It's a commonplace. I address it with my clients, right? I think that I've gotten comfortable to the point, and I have to say this, before, we sent a couple of emails back and forth about this topic, and this topic of conversation comes up in professional circles in limited quantities. I was a little afraid, honestly, of having this conversation in such a wide forum because of what the effect could be. It could have a very, very chilling effect. It could be very, very off-putting. And we're business owners. We're growing, and we've got to be concerned about margins and the ability for us to continue to expand our business. But as we got closer to this, and I started getting an email, I got an email from a colleague who recommended that I consider doing a TED Talk on diversity in financial planning and why we need more Black advisors and why Black families aren't working with planning. And I said that I don't have enough knowledge or background to be able to have that conversation. And this was coming from a white woman who's been building her business on her side very, very effectively. And she said that, you could be a great voice for that. And my first thought was, there's just no way. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. And then I saw your conversation on Facebook and how someone took offense to a statement that you made, and that short statement in the context of your entire podcast. Well, for people of color, it seems very, very well placed. But amongst a homogenous group, amongst white people, it came out offensive, and they completely ignored the rest of your podcast, right? So, or the entire focus went from being on, hey, here's this great advisor who's building a business. He's got great techniques, to, oh my God, Alan said this, right? And how do we break that? How do we get past that? Is what I'd like to be able to see us get to.
Yeah. And just to, I guess, reiterate a couple of those points. I mean, one, I want to be, I want to be clear that from my perspective as well, and I appreciate you saying that that it's scary to come on and have this conversation, because it's scary for me as well. I always prefer to exude confidence when I can, but, this is a terrifying conversation to have because of the repercussions, because I think the long-term effects are positive. And I think by just having this conversation and just opening the door to making it okay to have this conversation is a long-term positive thing. But in the short term, if I don't handle it properly, or if I say the wrong thing or offend the wrong group of people, it could harm my business. And more than just my business, it could harm my business partner, because people assume that I speak for Michael Kitces. And so I hold some of his work in my hands as well, not on purpose, but it is a difficult conversation to have. But quite frankly, I think we're just going to have to get over being scared of it and recognize that if, any short-term negative effects are going to be overcome by the long-term positive outcomes from just continuing to have this conversation.
I agree. And to add to that, Alan, I think it's a difficult conversation because I think now the way we talk about diversity, I actually hate the term diversity. I think it's a buzzword that's very hackneyed. It's often used in self-serving ways, especially when industries and firms are trying to prove that they're quote unquote progressive when they're really not. And we use diversity, the word diversity, as a way to sort of tiptoe around and not really address the underlying issues in our profession. Issues such as toxic whiteness, male privilege, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all the other systems of oppression that keep certain groups from entering and becoming successful in our profession, and that also keep certain people in the community from getting access to the important services that advisors provide. And so really having that conversation means it forces people to put a mirror up to themselves and really see where they've been personally complicit in the discrimination and the oppression, and really how they've benefited from it.
And I think it's important to say that we don't have to agree. We don't all have to agree on exactly what is going on, or exactly how things are defined, or where things are at, or anything else. All we have to be, I think where we have to start is we have to be willing to listen. And I'll admit, I grew up in the South, so South Atlanta, and I grew up where, I was always told that white men, especially Christian white men, are the most discriminated against group in America. And that came from affirmative action, right? Because affirmative action is basically, in this theory, is promoting everyone except for white men. So white men are being held back. Okay. So that's sort of how I grew up. Now, I did grow up with two Hispanic brothers. We have different dads. but I grew up with two brothers with a last name Dominguez. So I certainly saw, some of the racial discrimination against them. Now in Atlanta, I believe Georgia's population is something like 20 or 25% Hispanic. So wasn't as rare as a woman of color growing up in Salt Lake. So, there's certainly varying degrees to this. But I know I've always struggled with the term privilege. And this is a struggle I have because I look at it, I'm like, well, I grew up fairly poor. We didn't have a lot of money. I grew up in South Atlanta, which is not a good place to grow up. Quite frankly, it was a pretty crime-ridden area. I made myself, I paid for my own college. I built my own career. So how dare you tell me that I have privilege over someone? And it has taken me a while to be able to just shut up and be able to say okay, I had my circumstances. I am here and that's fine. You don't know my path, but I certainly don't know yours either. And to be able, I guess, just to go one step deeper and actually have a conversation about what does it mean and what is your perception of privilege and what is my perception of privilege and how do we, and where do we take that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a common response that I hear from people when bringing up the topic of privilege. And so typically what I do is I invite people to Google Peggy McIntosh. She was an American feminist and anti-racism activist, and she wrote an essay called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, where she kind of talks about the concept of privilege and how there are invisible systems out there that to this day continue to elevate certain people and not elevate other groups. So anyone who's interested in learning more about the concept of privilege, I would definitely recommend reading the essay called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
And we'll link to that in the show notes. I have never read that, so I'll definitely check that out. But we'll link to it in the show notes. Any listener can go read that viewpoint. And like I said, it's tough because I see hey, check your privilege, and I'm like, screw you, check yourself. You've got things to check too here. And I think that's part of it is sometimes, and this is not meant to be a generalization, but I have either been in part of conversations where privilege is used as a way of sort of shutting down the conversation of you don't know what you're talking about. You have privilege. Let's move on. Instead of a way of opening the conversation and the dialogue to say, look, you're what you just said is coming from a place of privilege. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it and recognize that we're coming from different places when we view this. And anything that opens dialogue, I think is going to be a positive. When it shuts down dialogue, that's when it's a negative. And I just think it can be misused. But it's also easy to just, if it ever gets misused once, we just assume it's always being misused. So screw you for saying privilege, right? I don't even want to talk about it. It's easy to go there. And it's hard to not go there, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. We shouldn't use the concept of privilege to demonize certain people. I mean, we all have some level of privilege, including myself at the end of the day. But we should be using it, like you said, to have open conversations about what that means and how you consciously and unconsciously be using your level of privilege to, like I said, elevate certain groups and not elevate others.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the argument of, well, there are a lot of countries much poorer than America. So if you were born in America, you have privilege. Right. So shut up because we all have privilege. And it's okay. Again, it's anything that's being used to shut down the conversation and not open up dialogue. So yes, as Americans, we do have privilege. I mean, we just do. I mean, that because we were born here, that doesn't mean we're all on an equal playing field. And really starting off
when talking about white privilege, here is how it comes across to me and to the people that are in my circle. If you and I had the exact same background, same education, the same social experiences, the key difference between you as a white male and me as a black male, or Kathleen or Roger Ma, who's in New York, is that you can walk, who is of Asian descent, you can walk into a room and you will never have had to have the concern about whether your color is going to be an issue, whether it's for the job or against getting the job. Whereas for me, my entire life, the question of color, and if I did very well in school, then I was being white, right? If I spoke well, then I'm trying to be something that I'm not because I'm because of the way I sound or because of the way I carry myself. And it's being compared to a white male. And that is where the privilege continues, that because that's a bias on our side, that we think that because if we don't sound a certain way, we don't carry ourselves a certain way, then we're being white. And this is the conversation that we have when a client says, well, you're different because the very fact that you said you're different because indicates unconscious bias or racism or prejudice. Because the expectation is that a person that looks like me shouldn't sound like me, dress like me, or do what I'm doing. And that's what we generally have to overcome. Whereas a white male can walk into that situation. Now, for a white male, the concern may be, am I not going to get the job because they have to hire a black person? Earlier you made a statement that you've never gone into a room where the conversation about, they're not qualified because they're black or whatever the race is. I would think that the other conversation would be the case where the fear of the people doing the interviews is, if we don't hire this person, will we be looked at as being racist? The other part of that is the expectation that the people doing the interviews look like you. And that whole conversation, we're expecting that the person doing the interview to hire someone looks like you, sounds like you, right? And that's a bias in and of itself.
Now, again, I'm trying to channel my inner listener just a little bit and just sort of my background to ask questions around this. Because you said something in there about sounding white. And again, I have heard the flip side argument that can come from the black community as well on stop trying to be white.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that.
So do you see?
That's exactly where I was going.
Okay, so do you see this on both sides?
Yeah.
I mean, is it that one side is just the side we're talking about today, and it's coming from both sides, or it is truly the side that we're talking about today, just the one that's important for solving some of these issues? Just in your opinion.
Within our community, it is a derogatory effect in that we are trying to live up to an expectation that isn't expected to be for us. On the other side, it is, well, look, you are able to be different. You're not like the rest of them. And so it's a problem on both sides, because my white counterparts view me as being somehow different or more qualified because I sound a certain way. And my black counterparts or my black friends coming to me saying, well, hey, here you are. I knew where you grew up. I knew how you came up. How are you like that? Black people have come up to, or people of color have learned how to do this thing called code switching, which generally refers to the way you speak in professional sense versus how you are with your homies, your friends, your boys. And I think that when we view it and when we're talking about it, for example, when Kathleen and I were talking at the conference, our conversation, the tone and the tenor of our conversation was was completely different than when we engaged with the rest of the group. So I think that there's some truth to that, but it comes with it's a double-edged sword, because within our communities we can be looked down upon or frowned as being an Uncle Tom, and in the other communities we're looked at as being the exception instead of being the rule.
Brian Thompson, we had him on the podcast recently, but he was a panelist on a diversity committee presentation at our conference this year. And he said something really powerful that I had never thought about. And he said, I don't want to be the token black guy. He said, I don't want to be the guy that when I walk into a room, everybody, and it's sort of what you were talking about, Bill, it's I don't want to be the guy that's looked at for all the answers. Just let me be and just learn. And let's not call attention to the fact that I'm a black man at a financial planning conference. Yeah. Which is, again, it's this double-edged sword of as a white male, I do not know how to solve this issue, right? And I don't expect any one person to, but I think more conversations with people that are experiencing, discrimination and oppression are better equipped to have this conversation to help, and just to help educate me on issues that we need to be looking at. However, you also don't want people to be uncomfortable with just get out of my face. Let me just sit here through a session and learn, tax loss harvesting from Michael Kitces, because, that's why I paid to be here.
This affects women as well, right? And here's a bias that I want to address as well. I think that this is important. We go to these conferences and there's an entire section dedicated to women's planning and women's issues and addressing women's concerns regarding financial planning. The most common thread in that entire session is that in those sessions that I have found, and I've gone to several workshops that are geared specifically towards working with women clients, is that there is no true difference. We just have to speak to them more. That's really what it boils down.
That's an interesting point. So that's what you're hearing from the from overall the presenters, is it's not actually acknowledging the differences. It's just saying, like, just talk to the wife as much as you talk to the husband.
Yeah, that's the conversation. That's what everything generally boils down to. Speak more to the wife, or speak to the female counterpart. Make sure that she is included in the conversation, and that you're addressing her concerns at the level that matters to her. Right? We don't have that. When we have diversity panels and we have diversity conversations, it boils down to, we got to get more Black advisors. We got to get more people of color in the industry, without addressing the underlying issues that help support why we don't have that level of diversity in the first place. If you're on an AUM-based model and you are looking for clients with $250,000 or better to manage their assets, most of those people are going to be white, something else, right? The average Black household has $13,000 to $50,000 of wealth, depending on what statistic and what survey you're looking at. So there's no exposure to people of color, generally speaking, to the concept of wealth building and financial planning. And the advisors that are in this industry aren't looking to work with them because they don't have the assets, the wealth, to do so. In Black communities, our experience has been with life insurance.
And I'd like to piggyback off that comment, Bill, because I think you make such a point, and that's sort of the point of frustration for me when we talk about diversity. It's very contradictory. As advisors, we can't promote diversity and claim to value it and say how important it is, while at the same time, we're making financial planning services at our firms accessible solely through the percentage of AUM model, a model that I believe is inherently racist because it's designed to serve people who have already accumulated a lot of wealth, which we know that tends to be white communities who, due to racist policies, have had generations build, inherit, and transfer wealth at a faster pace than people of color communities. So a lot of this talk, I believe it's just very contradictory. We say we value diversity, but not really.
No, that's something I've never thought about, because I say from stage very frequently that we are a profession for rich guys, right? But it's never occurred to me that it's actually rich white guys, and that our business model is keeping us from engaging with certain populations, which is, I have to believe, contributing to the lack of advisors that are coming into the profession, because, I don't think if we're trying to recruit more, Black men and women into financial planning, and other races, I shouldn't say just Black, just any minority population into financial planning, that, it's like, oh, but you only get to work with rich white guys and like learn how to hopefully talk to their wife better so that she'll stay with you when he dies and leave the assets here. Like, it's actually a business model change, in addition to just sort of an overall, industry shift.
Yeah. Rianco Dorsonville has a great article where she talks about stop speaking so much on diversity and spend more time on inclusion. She quotes a couple of different key speakers and authors on this topic, and I encourage everyone to go and read that on Investment News. But the biggest takeaway that I got from there is something similar to what you said earlier, Kathleen, about why the concept of diversity, I think is flawed. And the concept of inclusion needs to be more filled out. What I mean by that is this. Diversity is throwing everybody into a room and saying that we all need to get along, right? I need to have so many Black people, so many Asians, so many this, that, and the other, without acknowledging the cultural differences that do exist. There are clear cultural differences that have to do with where you were brought up, your family heritage. All of those things really do come into play. Inclusion is learning about those cultures and learning how to be not tolerant, because tolerance says whether I like you or not, I'm just going to have to deal with you, but being truly accepting. Okay, I don't care if you're a transgendered bisexual from the Kokomo Islands and you just happen to come over here and you only want to work with this type of client, right? That is the crux of it. One great example that I've heard, or as an analogy, is making a pot of stew, right? You can't just throw all the ingredients into the pot and boil it and think it's going to be good, right? You got to bring the water to a simmer, Slowly but surely add your ingredients, sprinkle a little bit of salt for some flavor. And if you're from down south, throw some hot sauce. There's the stereotype for you, right? And then slowly bring all of that together so that the stew comes out just right. And it takes time. It's not just put this thing on boil, throw everything in there, wait 15 minutes and expect it to be good. No. Because that's not how we're going to grow, not just as an industry, but as a people. We have to be not tolerant, but accepting of the differences between us. We have to acknowledge those differences. And, being culturally sensitive is something that I think is up to every individual person to figure out how culturally sensitive they can or can't be. At least acknowledging that and deciding whether or not you can or you can't accept it is a great place to be, is a great place to start at least. And I think we're missing out on some key groups. There are lots of Asians. I keep going back to Asians because as far as financial planners go, most Asians tend to work very homogeneously. They work very, very closely. Asian people who are looking for advisors tend to look for other Asian advisors or people that look like them. Black people, when they're looking for advisors, aren't looking for Black advisors. Indian people, when they're working with when they're looking for a financial planner, they want someone that tends to look like them. Black people, we are not. We tend to.
That's interesting because I would have expected that would have, gone both ways because, females tend to be looking for a female advisor is my understanding. So, but Black, do you think that's because they just assume there's no Black advisor out there? Or do you think it's just they truly don't care? Or is there this belief that somehow a white advisor is more qualified?
I think it's the first and the third. There's an unconscious bias that a white advisor or someone that's not necessarily of color may be more qualified. And we just don't see us in the business. You don't see Black people. You don't see people of color in and of itself doing extremely well. Melody Hobson is a very popular advisor. She's with Ariel Investments and she does very, very well. And she's got a great public persona. The richest Black person is Robert F. Smith. He's at this point the only Black billionaire on the Forbes billionaire list.
Yeah, there's like 400 billionaires. I don't remember the exact number. There's a bunch of them.
And of that list, there's only one African American. One, right? So we don't see it. And we don't get exposed to it. And I would say that the same issue is probably existing within the Latino or Hispanic community as well.
So, we've brought up a couple of interesting things or interesting points that I've never really considered. And I think that, again, this is a topic we could talk about for weeks, right? And particularly the two of you with your experiences, like this is something y'all could you could talk about forever. And I want to continue this conversation. I also, though, want to pull out some of the key points you've talked about, which I think are really interesting. One is, again, just back to this service model thing is killing me because this is something that I'm kicking myself for never having thought of. But and that is that truly our service model is not built to engage with minority populations. And so as a profession, we've been built to serve white men. So it's no wonder why we attract white men into the profession. And that's just critical that we have to continue. And of course, we're heavily involved in just promoting a new service model. It's always been about, working with younger people. I haven't ever framed it as, hey, this is a way to engage with minority populations that have never had access to a financial planner before. But it truly is just looking at different service models. But the second piece to your point is it's not just about throwing a bunch of the correct mix. It's not just about like, oh, thank goodness we're at 50% female week one. It is a lot about this sort of these unconscious and conscious biases that we're bringing to the table and doing things either deliberately or accidentally that are creating these systems that do promote one race or gender or whatnot over the other. And I can give one example, and that's, that I have heard, and that is if you always, especially in financial services, if you always hire based on experience, if you're always hiring with 3 to 5 years of experience, you will forever hire white men because they are the only ones with 3 to 5 years of experience. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And so we have to be willing to take a step back and go, what's more important, 3 years of experience, or do we believe that we are better diverse than we are not diverse, and therefore we are better having someone with less experience that brings a different perspective into the firm, and therefore we shouldn't care as much about experiences. We should care about increasing the the different viewpoints that we have in the firm.
I would love to see more CFP programs in HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. That would be one of the best things to possibly happen to increase awareness and access to people of color or minority groups to financial planning. If we had more CFP programs, I know Winston-Salem right now has a program, but I think they're the only HBCU that I can think of off the top of my head. But Tuskegee.
Oh, wow.
Right. There are so many great schools that could be doing this. Tuskegee, Howard, Florida A&M University, Bethune-Cookman, Alabama A&M, Prairie View. All of these schools are graduating top-notch people of color that are entering the professional realm who don't know what financial planning is. They have no idea about the career. They have no idea about how to engage that. And for people of color, they start building wealth through their 401k plans or through real estate. And if they had exposure to a financial advisor, imagine how that could change their viewpoints. You know, how that can continue to grow the communities and help address this disparity, especially the wealth gap between African Americans and white families here in this country, or black families and white families in this country, or Hispanics and white families in this country. You know.
Yeah, I'm in agreement 100%. I believe, moving forward, our educators are going to play such an instrumental role in making strides when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Just a short little story about me. Financial planning as a career was never on my radar. When I was in grad school, I was going to be a commercial banker, and I actually already had a job lined up as a commercial banker before I graduated. And during my last year of my master's program, I decided a financial planning course for fun. And that class changed my life. It was there I met a professor who was also a certified financial planner. And for some reason, he saw something in me. I guess he liked my contributions in class. And he told me, he was like, well, why don't you think about becoming a financial advisor? And initially I thought, no, it's just a sales role, or that's just a career for white people. I don't see anybody who looks like me who's successful in that industry. But he was very persistent to the point where he offered me up at his firm. And so that's how I got my foot into the door. So I think definitely our educators are going to play a huge role in sort of helping us bridge that gap, that diversity gap.
One of the topics that I'd love to have, I believe our diversity committee may be hosting a webinar on this topic. If not, or in conjunction, maybe we could have someone on the podcast that's an expert in this area, but is on the topic of hiring diverse. So this is something that I have seen advisors struggle with. It's something that I have struggled with, particularly as we have moved headquarters from being virtual to being in Montana, where, quite frankly, I believe of the 50,000 plus people that are in Bozeman, there are 200 African Americans, 200 out of 50,000. So when I look at it and I say, okay, look, we want to be diverse. Like, I do believe that and maybe to use Bill's terminology, like, we want to be diverse, but we also want to be inclusive. I believe that we are a better company when we have people from varied backgrounds that have varied experiences that bring that to the table to help our organization move forward and therefore help our advisors. Hiring and keeping gender equality is pretty easy, I would say, in Bozeman. Keeping racial and having anyone that's not white is going to be a challenge. So I feel like I'm faced with this decision of, do we hire people that have less experience or are not as qualified just because of their race? Now, Kathleen, you and I had a conversation around this because, my concern has been, I never want someone to feel discredited or be assumed that they aren't, quote unquote, good enough. They just got the job because they were Black, right? Like, that's not fair. And that's not what we're saying. But is it what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to say that, but like, is it okay to say, look, we want to hire people of color because we believe it's better for our firm? Or does that speak the wrong message? Like, do you have any opinions on that? Just how to frame the discussion of how to hire diverse without being discriminatory against white men? Or is that what I need to do?
I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with targeting diversity in your firm and wanting to hire more women or people of color. But it all goes back to the point that Bill made earlier about making sure you're differentiating between diversity and inclusion. Okay, it's not enough to hire a bunch of women at your firm. Bill, for example, could hire more women at his firm if he wanted to. That's not going to make his company culture more inclusive. He could hire more women, but if they're constantly bumping up against glass ceilings, or they're being discouraged by microaggressions, or they're missing out on building key relationships because their male boss doesn't believe in having one-on-one lunches with women, that's a problem. And so that's why I feel like it's problematic to just focus on diversity alone. Oh, we have to get more women, or we got to get more women of color. It doesn't really mean anything. Just focusing on diversity alone, targeting more women or people of color, that's just not enough. We have to do more than just encourage diverse groups to apply to our firms. We have to make sure that, number one, our firms are accessible, that our workspaces are not hostile to certain groups, and we have to get rid of oppressive practices that make certain groups feel unwelcome in our firms. I think that's where you start.
I agree. I think the idea to your point, I've had the opposite problem. I can't keep a male in my office because the positions that I've had available have been positions that were subordinate to me. I wasn't hiring at the time for an associate planner. I was hiring for a receptionist and a client service associate. And the idea was, okay, at some point in time, we're going to transition that up into a planner or so on and so forth. I had three male advisors, or three males that actually came on board, and not a single one of them lasted more than a month before I had my hires, which both of the ones that are working for me now are female. And it's not to say that, a male couldn't or wouldn't do the job. It's on my side. My question was, are they not staying because they don't see a path for growth? Or is it because they feel like between men, not necessarily race, but between men, is this a contest of testosterone, right? The fact that, do they feel like because they have to answer to me that's going to be a problem? And for me, two of the individuals that worked here, two of the males were white. One of the questions that I had was, is race an issue? Could this be a thing? And I don't think that that's on the other side, if I didn't look the way that I looked, I don't think that that'd be a question that I'd be asking myself. I don't think that would ever actually be a concern for me if I wasn't Black. I don't think I'd ever have to or want to ask myself that question. And I feel terrible for thinking that way, but at 33 years of age and with the experiences that I've had, it's almost impossible at this point in time to not at some level see through the prism of race. At least ask that question. Even if I think even when I'm saying I don't want race to be an issue, I'm making it an issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to say it is impossible to be unbiased? Like, we all have bias. We all have our past and just the events that have happened in our life. Like, we're all going to approach situations with bias, and the biases are just different. And to your point, like, you're looking at something through the prism of race, but you're acknowledging that you're doing it. And so I think that's sort of, maybe that's the big step to make, is not just looking at it through a prism of race without acknowledging it, and being able to take one step back and go, okay, I am doing this because I want to think this through, and I want to be sure that race is not the issue here, or maybe it is, and I want to ask that question without it just being the assumption. And so therefore we're not realizing the prism through which we're looking through.
What I would like is if we can all agree to this one thing. Can we all agree that unless you're truly colorblind, meaning you're only seeing black, white, and gray, can we agree that when someone says, I don't see color, it is absolute, and you might have to censor this, but it's absolute bullshit. We see color. People see color. We identify the differences amongst each other. And when a white person tells a person of color that they don't see color, I think it's more offensive in some cases than using the N-word. because it's literally a slap in the face and saying that looking at me as you look at me right now, you mean to tell me you don't see that I am of dark complexion with kinky brown hair, with kinky black hair. You don't see that at all.
Yes. And I'd like to expound on that if I could. You just brought up a really great point. I personally find it very frustrating when people say they don't see color or they don't see race, and that's really their best approach to treating people equally. Actually, they're wrong. Because if you don't see race, then how do you see racism? If you don't see race, then how do you see discrimination? If you don't see race, then how do you see injustice? So really, this self-proclaimed color blindness, it actually has the opposite effect of silencing and disregarding the experiences of diverse communities. And I think it's really counterproductive to actually solving the challenges around diversity. So thank you so much, Bill, for bringing that up.
Yeah, I from what you're saying, I can see that, if I say I don't regard race or I'm not looking at race, it's almost just like pure ignorance, just because there's no way you don't see that, and come on, don't be an idiot. Just call it what it is and just say that, because I'm going to view race, and I'm either going to view it as a positive or a negative. I mean, you can try to view it as a neutral, right? But it's either I don't think you're qualified because you're Black, and how could you possibly be, right? That's the negative side. There's, you have a unique background that's going to bring something to this firm, and so therefore that's a positive. And I'm sure there's a neutral ground where we can take that out of it. And I guess that's what's hard, is determining how much, particularly from a hiring perspective, how much is allowable to be based on race and I shouldn't say just race, but just overall differences. How much of that is a good thing? And then when have you gone too far? And again, you end up with, turning someone into the token Black guy at the firm or the token woman at the firm, just because, you felt like, oh, good, got to get one in here to be sure we check that box on the HR report, I think that's tough to just try to figure out how to balance those two.
With that statement, I say again, that's the key for people of color in general. That's the key differentiator in identifying, the statement of white privilege or being the older white male. The concern for the older white male is never going to be whether or not they're the token white guy at a firm. That will never be a concern for them. It'll never be a question. But for women, for minorities, for LGBT communities, that's going to always be a question, at least in today's society.
So in closing, I'll give you both the opportunity and you can speak this directly to me, because I think I'm representative from a just overall demographic standpoint of our listeners. So for listeners, but directed at me, I guess, if there's one thing that you want me to personally take away from this conversation, just one thing you want to be sure I walk away with, what's the one thing that you haven't been willing to say or haven't been able to say or have been afraid to say to me that you want to be sure I hear?
Sure. Just that, there are things that we can do to break down barriers to be more inclusive. There are solutions out there. And it involves taking an inward look at ourselves first. We need to check ourselves. We need to check our biases. We need to check what we consider to be qualified. We need to check our hiring procedures. We need to check our interview questions. We need to ask ourselves, is this a firm where someone has to know the right people to get in? Because that's another way that we build barriers to our industry is, making jobs exclusive or, some information is not easily accessible to everyone in terms of job openings or things of that nature. So, yeah, that's what I want to walk away with.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, Bill?
For me, it is don't be afraid to address the elephant in the room and be honest and forthright. Be respectful, be tactful, but address it. Know that there are differences. Know that there are biases. Know what yours are and understand the environment and the culture that you're creating so that you know how you can, if you're willing to, how you can address it, at least within your own environment. That's the most important thing. Be willing to address it and, know the elephant in the room. If you have an issue with, here in the South, we say sweetheart and honey and we hug. That's not going to fly up north, right? So, in the culture and the environment that I'm in, that's normal. Once again, within reason, right? Because that doesn't mean you just walk up to a stranger and you give them a hug, So knowing that, I've taken it upon myself to always ask before I go in for a hug, is it okay if I give you a hug? Is it okay if I speak like this, or would you prefer ma'am, or would you prefer Mrs.? So don't be afraid to address that. Don't be afraid to address the elephant in the room. Be respectful, be tactful, but go at it and make sure that it's a conversation that you and your office and your culture can have, so that you guys have a better understanding of where you're going to go.
Kathleen, Bill, thank you both so much for having the courage, honestly, to come on the show and talk about this publicly. This is a difficult conversation, but I think we're all in agreement that it's a conversation that needs to be had and needs to be continually had over and over and over, because we do have a long way to go. We have come a long way, I believe, in the last several decades, but we have a long way to go. And I'm excited that we can all be a part of the change that we hope to see. So thank you both.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes with myself and Kitsis, and to finally find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.